I must confess, over the last few decades, I've been somewhat disappointed in the special years that the Holy Father has called on. For example, in the late 90s, he declared a Marian year. And when you consider the multi-level devotion we have to the Blessed Virgin Mary, not just discipleship, but her symbolism of the Church itself, a real year that could have been a year of teaching the Church and ecclesiology, which is what Mary symbolizes, the various feasts and the various titles she has and what that means, the theological distinctions that are always pointing to how we understand Christ better. For the most part, in many parishes, including the one I was in, all that was simply reduced to a year of the Rosary. A couple years later, Pope John Paul II declared a Eucharistic year. Again, a good year of the celebration of the Mass and all the various aspects of it. And what many people don't know, there are the multiplicity of ways in the Catholic Church that the Mass is celebrated, not just Latin and not Latin, but many of the Eastern rites of the Catholic Church that have developed over the centuries, a real richness and Catholicity of how we celebrate the Eucharist. But at least in the parish I was in, it was reduced to a year of adoration. Not that I have anything against adoration, but even adoration comes from the celebration of the Mass. A few years later, just to name a couple more, there was a year of St. Paul. I observed it by preaching the second reading whenever it was St. Paul. That was my homily, the theme of the second reading. But for the most part, not much was really done by the parishes that I knew of. And of course, there was the year of the consecrated life. How many here remember the year of the consecrated life? See what I mean? Pope Francis declared a year of the consecrated life, and virtually nothing was done in the parishes. But perhaps for me, the biggest disappointment, although not in how the parish I was at celebrated and observed it, but how I saw in many other places, was the Year of Mercy, which happened about 5 or 6 years ago. And I still love to harp on it every now and again, because it really was, for many parishes, a lost opportunity and a wasted year. Because how many, at least where I was from, how many took advantage of the Year of Mercy by returning to the sacrament of confession? Perhaps for many, haven't gone in many years. How many, considering in the Year of Mercy, especially in light of the fact that Jesus says, settle with your opponent on the way to court, lest you be the one thrown into jail? Well, why would you be thrown into jail? Because you're the guilty one. How many observe the Year of Mercy by thinking, is there anyone I need to ask mercy from? I need to ask forgiveness from? A much harder task, I think, than actually giving forgiveness. How many were renewed and reviewed and relearned the corporal and spiritual works of mercy, a very traditional part of the whole tradition of mercy in the Church? And how many, in deference to today's gospel, thought, who do I need to forgive during this holy year of mercy? A lot of things could be covered and considered, but for the most part, in many parishes, all we did was celebrate the mercy of God, or as I like to put it, wallow in God's mercy, and in some places walk through a silly holy door. I remember taking a tour of Quebec, and the tour guide, as we passed the cathedral in Quebec, he said, and this is a year of mercy, and there's a special holy door, and the church teaches you if you go through the holy door, you go straight to heaven. I turned to my friend who was a priest and said, do you want to tell him, or should I? Oddly enough, we didn't say anything. But what we have in today's gospel is part of those aspects of the call we are to be a people of mercy. And specifically, the angle Jesus gives is the mercy we bestow on people who have harmed us. There is the seeking forgiveness, but that's another gospel, another homily. But the question is asked of Jesus, when my brother sins against me, how often must I forgive? And of course, we can imagine Peter thought he was perhaps clever. 7 times, because of course 7 is that symbolic number symbolizing perfection. Should I forgive him perfectly? Well, who can say no to that? But Jesus, never to be outdone, basically says no, 70 times perfection. 77 times. Above and beyond perfection. We must forgive absolutely. And it's not a suggestion. And it has no classification. He doesn't say only if they're sorry. You can imagine some of the debates I've gotten into some people over, do I have to forgive someone if they're not sorry for what they did? And of course, Jesus doesn't say that. And that becomes a real bone of contention for some people. They don't want to forgive unless the other person realizes what they've done. But Jesus doesn't classify that at all. If there's ever a mandate that is more clear let me know, because this one is definitely clear. We must forgive. That's at the heart of who we are as a people of God. Forgive those who have done harm to us. Seek forgiveness to those perhaps whom we have harmed. And it's not an easy task. It's not an easy task. Sometimes we love holding grudges. Sometimes we love holding things over people's heads. There's a real power bestowed in, I forgive you. But Jesus doesn't give us that option. And then when we consider, what can people do to us? What is it people did? Sometimes people think, what happened to me was so horrible, I will never forgive. And somehow think that's an entitlement. Until we realize, let's just think of the worst thing anyone could possibly do to anybody. The guiltiest offender to the most innocent of victims. That there's nothing, absolutely nothing, that could happen to any of us, ever, that is so horrible that it constitutes a free ticket to heaven. If there is, please let it happen to me. But what does bring us to heaven is forgiveness and mercy. Not just 7 times, but 70 times 7. And nowhere in this does Jesus say it's easy. But he gives us that very dynamic parable of a man who begged forgiveness from the king, but refused to give it to his own underlings. And a thing I want to be clear on with regard to forgiveness, because I do hear a lot of people speaking to me about forgiveness and difficulty in forgiving, and sometimes even confessing it as a sin that they have difficulty forgiving. Forgiveness is not an off switch. And forgiveness does not happen overnight. Forgiveness is a process that we must commit ourselves to, because sometimes things can happen to us that are bad, that are difficult to get over. Again, Jesus doesn't classify it. As I said, nothing constitutes a free ticket to heaven, but it is a process that may take us the rest of our lives, or may take us some time, may not take us long at all. But we must at least be committed to the process of forgiveness. It also doesn't mean that when we forgive, we suddenly have bubbly feelings about what happened to us or the person who did it to us. Forgiveness doesn't mean we trust or that we may turn our back on that person again, or that we may trust our loved ones or those over which we have care and responsibility. Forgiveness doesn't mean we suddenly are friendly with them. I mean, I always like to ask people when it comes to forgiveness, how many here, and if you want to raise your hand, please raise your hand, how many here think the Blessed Virgin Mary forgave those who crucified her son? Obvious, she's the perfect disciple. How many here think she wanted to have them over for tea and crumpets every Sunday afternoon? How many here think that the disciples who knew her during her life came up to her every now and again and said, tell us what it was like to sit there at the foot of the cross and watch your son die for the sins of the world? Probably not many, if they had any prudence. It would not have been a good memory for her to speak of, to see her son crucified, even if she had full understanding of what it was about. Who would want to relive and remember that? And of course she forgave, but it doesn't mean she was on friendly terms and sought them out. Even Jesus from the cross said, Father, forgive them, of those previously he had said, you hypocrites and you frauds and you blind fools. But forgiveness is a process where we no longer let the harm that was done to us consume us to such a point that we become fixated on it with an animosity and a hatred toward those who did it to us. We can move on. We can let go. Doesn't mean it's no longer painful. Doesn't mean it's no longer a bad memory. But we are able to come to terms with it in a way that we can move forward to adequately and mercifully live the gospel we are called to live. But it's not an off switch, and it doesn't mean we no longer have negative feelings about what may have happened to us. And I think it's important to address because, like I said, I do hear a lot about that, of people who are very concerned. They feel they have difficulty in forgiving. But do we understand what forgiveness really entails? And there are probably so many facets of it, I don't think I could cover them all in just a few minutes homily. But what we hear in the gospel is a mandate, and a mandate above mandates. We don't just forgive perfectly, but 70 times perfection. Not a suggestion, but a mandate. And there's nothing that could happen to any of us that is so horrible that it constitutes a free ticket to heaven. We must work toward that forgiveness, and it's something worth reflecting on. I wish we'd done more of it during the Holy Year of Mercy, but we don't need just a Holy Year of Mercy to continue to grow in this very important part of our faith. So I think all of us have had the experience of something happening to us in which it's difficult to forgive. Sometimes it might be something as simple as just giving time and distance. Others, it could be something much more serious and difficult and challenging. But in the Eucharist we celebrate in the Mass today, let us really remember that as the Eucharist is at the heart of our lives as Catholics, forgiveness is at the heart of what Jesus commands us to do. And it's not just something we do as a matter of automatic, as Peter says, 7 times, but in totality, that it becomes almost a fixation for us, not to hold a grudge, but to find ways to forgive. And nowhere in the gospel does Jesus say it is easy. But we have examples in Christ who forgave, in the Blessed Mother who must have forgiven if we're to hold her to the level of discipleship for which we honor her, and other saints, John Paul II, who said he forgave the one who shot him, Maria Goretti, who before she died said she forgave the young man who stabbed her to death. Examples of forgiveness of people throughout our church's history among our saints that we can pray for intercession as we receive the grace from this Eucharist to live out what perhaps could be among the most difficult commands that Jesus gives us. But we are nonetheless called to be a reconciling community in which we seek out forgiveness for those whom we have harmed and sinned against. But as we see in today's gospel, a very strong command for all of us to work toward and be committed to the process of forgiveness.